My brothers and my sisters, there comes a season in every one of our lives when heaven seems quiet. You pray and the heavens don't thunder. You cry and no answer echoes back. You worship, but it feels like you're lifting your hands into an empty sky. And it is in that silence, not the noise, not the shouting, and not the clapping, that God is shaping the deepest part of who you are. See, we don't mind trusting God when he's talking. We don't mind trusting him when the doors are swinging open, when blessings are raining down, when favor is flowing. But can you trust him when he goes silent? Can you still walk by faith when the roadmap is blank? Can you still declare his goodness when you can't hear his voice? Today, I want to remind you, his silence does not mean his absence. His quiet does not mean his neglect. Oh, no, no, no. Sometimes the teacher is silent and because the test is so buckle grass. Lean in and let's walk together through the stillness, because I came to tell somebody that there is power in trusting God in the silence. God's silence is not God's absence. And many times when we go through seasons where it seems like heaven has closed its mouth, our human nature immediately assumes that we have been abandoned, overlooked, or forgotten. We are conditioned to measure God's presence by what we hear, by what we feel, or by what we can see unfolding around us. But the truth is that the presence of God is not limited to sound, nor is his activity restricted to what our senses can detect. Just because he is not speaking does not mean he is not there. Just because he is not answering in the way we expected does not mean he is not moving behind the scenes. God is the kind of father who can sit in the silence with you, not saying a word, yet still holding everything in place, still sustaining your life, still keeping you from falling apart when everything else is crumbling. His silence does not diminish his sovereignty, and his quiet does not erase his power. Think about how we often misinterpret silence in relationships. If someone doesn't respond to our message, we may assume they are angry or uninterested, when in reality, they may simply be busy or preparing something meaningful to share later. In the same way, when God is silent, it is not a signal that he has abandoned the conversation. It is often a signal that he is arranging circumstances in such a way that when he finally speaks, his word will collide perfectly with his work. Silence can be a strategic pause, not a cruel punishment. It can be the sacred stillness where God does his most delicate and precise work in our lives. Consider the moments in Scripture when heaven went quiet. Between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there were 400 years of prophetic silence, no prophet, no fresh revelation, no audible word from heaven. Yet during those years, kingdoms shifted, roads were built, languages spread, and the stage was being set for the coming of Christ. What looked like silence was actually preparation. What felt like absence was actually alignment. If God had spoken too soon, the timing would not have been right. If he had revealed his plan prematurely, the fullness, what he wanted to accomplish, would not have been realized. Silence was not absence, it was strategy. In our personal lives, we often discover that the seasons we thought were the most silent were actually the seasons where God was closest. Think back to the times when you didn't know how you were going to make it, yet you did. Think about the nights Think you cried yourself to sleep, feeling as if no one heard you, yet you woke up the next morning with enough strength to take another step. That was not absence, that was presence in disguise. God was there steadying your heart, whispering peace into your soul, even if you couldn't hear it in your ears. When we learn to trust God in his silence, we come to understand that his presence is not dependent on our perception. Our feelings may tell us we are alone, but our faith reminds us that he promised never to leave nor forsake us. Faith is not built on noise, it is built on knowing. And knowing says, even if I don't hear him, I trust he is here. Even if I don't see him, I trust he is near. Even if I don't feel him, I know he is still working on my behalf. God's silence is not his absence. It is an invitation to trust his heart when his mouth is closed. The teacher is quiet during the test. Anyone who has ever sat in a classroom knows the moment when the instructor hands out the exam. Up until that point, the teacher is explaining, reviewing, and guiding, making sure the students understand the material. But when the test begins, the room shifts into silence. The teacher doesn't speak, not because they are gone, but because the test is meant to reveal what the student has already learned. The teacher's silence is not abandonment, it is expectation. In the same way, there are seasons in our walk with God when the talking stops and we feel like we're left on our own. But in truth, God has already poured his word, his promises, and his instructions into our hearts. The silence comes to see if we will trust what he has already taught us. We often forget that silence is a part of spiritual growth. If God held our hand and spoke every single step of the way, we would never learn to stand on our own faith. As silence is the proving ground of belief. It is where what we've heard on Sunday morning has to work on Monday night. It's the moment when the verse you underlined in your Bible becomes the lifeline you cling to in the middle of a storm. The teacher doesn't speak because he already knows the answer. The test isn't for him, it's for you. It's designed to reveal what's in you, to strengthen what is weak, and to stretch what has grown too comfortable. Think about Abraham being told to sacrifice Isaac. God had already spoken promises over his life, promises that nations would come through his seed. But when the test came, God went silent. Abraham walked up the mountain with no explanation, no reassurance, no audible word to calm his fears. The silence wasn't punishment, it was preparation. God already knew Abraham's faith. The silence gave Abraham the opportunity to live it out. When the teacher is quiet, the student has the chance to demonstrate that the lesson has been learned. It's the same in our lives. When the job is uncertain, when the diagnosis is unclear, when the direction isn't obvious, God may not speak in the way we want him to. We want a clear answer, a booming voice, a direct sign. But sometimes he remains quiet, watching to see if we will trust him based on what he has already said. Will we believe his word even when we don't hear his voice? Will we lean on his promises even when we don't see immediate results? The silence is the test, and how we respond determines whether we move into the next level of growth. Silence in the test does not mean God has left the classroom of your life. He is still there, watching closely, guarding the environment, and making sure nothing interferes with what he is doing in you. Just like a teacher walks the aisles observing, making sure no one cheats or disrupts the test, God is present in the silence, overseeing every detail. His quiet presence is still protection. His unseen hand is still guiding. The silence does not diminish his authority. It amplifies your opportunity to trust him. The beauty of the test is that it is not meant to destroy you, but to promote you. When you pass a test in school, you advance to the next grade. When you endure a season of God's silence, you emerge with stronger faith, deeper roots, and a greater awareness of his sustaining power. The test is not forever. Silence is temporary. And when it is over, the teacher speaks again, not to review the test you've taken, but to usher you into new lessons, new growth, and new dimensions of faith you never thought possible. Silence is the soil where faith grows. Faith does not flourish in the noise of constant confirmation or the comfort of constant reassurance. Faith is born and strengthened in the space where answers are not immediately given, where the path is not fully clear, and where God chooses to work in ways unseen. Just as a seed is buried in the dark, unseen soil before it ever breaks through the ground. So our faith must be planted in silence before it can emerge strong enough to face the storms of life. The soil is not glamorous. The soil is not celebrated. The soil is not visible, but the soil is necessary. It is in that hidden place under the weight of silence, that faith, it begins to root itself deeply in the character of God, or rather than the comfort of circumstances. When everything is loud and visible, we may lean on what we see, but when everything is quiet and uncertain, we are forced to lean on what we believe. Silence strips us of the distractions and compels us to ask, do I truly trust him when I don't hear him? This is the essence of faith. Not depending on what is obvious, but holding on to what is promised. The soil of silence makes us wrestle with doubts, fears, and insecurities, and in that wrestling, our roots go deeper. The deeper the root, the stronger the tree. Without the silence, without the dark soil, our faith would remain shallow, unable to withstand trials. Consider Joseph, who received dreams of greatness as a young man, but then spent years in prisons and pits with no voice from heaven explaining why. A silence covered his journey, but in that silence, his faith was growing roots. He learned to trust God when he had no audience, no platform, and no visible blessing. And when the time came, his faith was strong enough to carry the weight of leadership in Egypt. The silence was not wasted. It was the soil where his destiny matured. Our own lives mirror this truth. We want God to speak loudly and immediately to every question we ask, but instead we often encounter seasons where he says nothing. Those seasons feel uncomfortable, but they are sacred. They are the soil seasons. In them, we learn patience. We learn resilience. We learn to cling to God's word when no fresh word is coming. Faith becomes less about feelings and more about conviction. It becomes less about external evidence and more about internal certainty. The silence is not God ignoring us. It is God rooting us so that when the storms of life come, we are not easily shaken. Just as the farmer does not dig up the seed every day to check if it is growing, we must resist the temptation to assume silence means nothing is happening. Underneath the soil, where no eye can see, life is forming. Something is shifting, stretching, expanding, preparing to break through. In the same way, God is doing his deepest work in us when we feel nothing, hear nothing, and see nothing. Silence is the incubator of faith, and what is birthed in that silence will outlast the noise of temporary trials. The strength of faith that survives silence is the kind of faith that can move mountains, endure suffering, and hold on to hope when everything else falls apart. The silence that once felt heavy becomes the very ground from which unshakable belief rises. Faith that has been tested in silence is faith that cannot be uprooted by storms. And so, while we may not enjoy the quiet seasons, we must embrace them, for they are the soil where faith is planted, nourished, and grown into something greater than we could ever imagine. Your patience in the silence positions you for promise. Waiting is one of the hardest disciplines of faith, but because everything in us wants resolution, answers, and clarity right now, silence stretches our souls in ways that are uncomfortable, but it is precisely that stretch that makes room for the promises of God to unfold in their fullness. The silence is not wasted time, it is positioning time. It is in the waiting that God aligns circumstances, prepares opportunities, and matures us to handle what we are praying for. If we rush ahead of the process, we risk stepping into blessings unprepared. But when we endure the silence with patience, we find ourselves standing exactly where we need to be when the promise arrives. Patience is not passive, it is active trust. It is saying, I don't hear him, I don't see him, but I will not move until he tells me to. That restraint keeps us from making decisions out of panic and fear, and it stops us from forcing doors open that God has not ordained. In the silence, impatience will tempt us to grab for solutions of our own, but patience reminds us that what God has planned cannot be rushed. Just as a fruit ripens in its season, the promises of God are tied to divine timing. Picking them too early makes them bitter. Waiting patiently allows them to mature into sweetness. Think about Israel wandering in the wilderness. They could have reached the promised land much faster in terms of distance, but God led them through years of waiting because they were not yet positioned to possess it. They needed to learn dependence, obedience, and trust in his provision. The silence of those years was not denial of the promise, it was preparation for it. Their patience, or in many cases their lack of it, determined how quickly or slowly they stepped into what God had spoken. The patience in the silence is what positions us for inheritance, because the promise is not just about what God gives us, but about who we become in the process of receiving it. Look also at David. Anointed as king while still a shepherd boy, he carried a promise that took years to materialize. Between the oil and the throne were caves, battles, betrayals, and long stretches of silence. Yet each season of waiting was positioning him, shaping his character, deepening his reliance on God, and training him for the weight of kingship. Had David rushed the process, he might have had the crown without the maturity to carry it. Patience during the silence ensured he was ready when the time came. Our lives are no different. Many of us are waiting for promises, breakthrough in finances, healing in our bodies. restoration in our families, or clarity in our purpose. The silence that surrounds those prayers can feel unbearable, but patience is the bridge between petition and fulfillment. Every day of waiting is not a delay, but a step of positioning God and aligning hearts, opening doors, and preparing us to handle the very thing we're waiting for. And when the promise finally comes, we will see how every silent season was necessary to put us in the right place at the right time. The truth is, a silence without patience breeds frustration, but silence with patience produces faith. If we can learn to wait without complaining, to trust without demanding, and to rest without striving, we will discover that the silence is not punishment, but positioning. Well, patience transforms what feels like wasted time into holy preparation. And when God's promise finally arrives, and it will not find us restless or unready, it will find us positioned, matured, and prepared to walk fully into the blessing He has ordained. When God is quiet, He is still working. Silence is never inactivity in the hands of God. Just because we cannot see the movement or hear the progress does not mean the heavens are idle. Often, God does His greatest work in unseen places, arranging circumstances, shifting hearts, and aligning details that will one day come together in a way we never imagined. The silence we experience is not the sound of God ignoring us. It is the sound of God constructing something beyond our vision. Like a master weaver working on the backside of a tapestry, the knots and threads may look messy to us, but on the other side, a beautiful picture is being formed. We are people of immediacy. We want instant results, immediate answers, and visible evidence that our prayers are working. When we do not get that, we assume nothing is happening, but the truth is some of God's most powerful works are birthed in silence. When Esther was being raised in obscurity, God was preparing her for a throne. When Moses was hidden on the backside of the desert, God was preparing him for leadership. When Jesus lay in the tomb for 3 silent days, God was orchestrating the greatest victory the world had ever known. Silence does not mean stillness. It often means strategy. Think about how a seed functions. Once it is placed in the ground, nothing appears to be happening. Days pass, and the soil looks unchanged. But beneath the surface, the seed is breaking, roots are spreading, and life is beginning to push upward. If we judged by appearances, we would assume the seed was dead. In reality, it is alive and working where no eye can see. God works the same way in our lives. In the silence, He is developing roots in us, connecting us to the right people, closing doors that would harm us, and preparing opportunities we cannot yet access. What looks like inactivity is divine productivity. Sometimes the silence is God working in others around us. The answer to your prayer may involve someone else's heart being softened, a decision being shifted, or a situation being restructured. You may not hear anything, but God is working on people you cannot see and in places you cannot go with timing you cannot control. His silence is not evidence of neglect. It is evidence of orchestration. He is conducting a symphony where every instrument must come in at the right moment, and silence is part of the song. It is also important to remember that God works in us during the silence. While we wait for Him to act externally, He is shaping us internally. He is stretching our patience, deepening our character and refining our trust. If he answered too quickly, we might miss the growth that comes from the waiting. His silence creates space for transformation. The quiet seasons allow us to confront our fears, examine our motives, and anchor our faith. When the work inside us is complete, we are prepared to carry the weight of what he releases outside of us. Even when we cannot trace his hand, we can trust his heart. His silence is not a sign that he has stopped moving. It is a reminder that his work is not always meant to be seen until the appointed time. The invisible progress will one day become visible promise. What feels like a standstill is often momentum building in places we cannot measure. And when God finally reveals what he has been working on all along, we will understand that every moment of silence was filled with divine activity. He may be quiet, but he is never still.